Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. And today we're going to take a look back at one of the most important voices in the history of American music, at least in my humble opinion, as we go back and look a little bit at the music of New York folk and protest singer Phil Ochs. Phil Ochs is somebody that I have been a huge fan of for a very long time. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't even really remember when or how I got turned on to his music. As far as I'm concerned, it was some sort of happy miracle because I have been listening to his records consistently ever since. If you go back and you look at music from the 1960s into like the early 1970s, I would say that Phil Ochs is easily in my top 5 favorite artists of all time. Phil Ochs was born on December 19th, 1940 in El Paso, Texas. Phil Ochs' first musical love was the songs of Elvis Presley, Hank Williams, and Lefty Frizzell. It was his college roommate, Jim Glover, at Ohio State University, who really first introduced Phil to left-leaning music like the music of artists like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. It was also Jim Glover who famously taught Phil Ochs how to play the guitar. Now, Phil Ochs, of course, throughout his career was known as being a tremendous lyricist and singer, but I would make the argument that he was also a very underrated guitar player, especially when you go back and listen to those records. His guitar playing was as good as anybody that came out of that Greenwich Village scene. He and his college roommate Jim Glover very briefly started a folk duo that they called the Singing Socialists. Now, unfortunately for the world, that band broke up before their first ever performance. Jim Glover would later move to New York and become a relatively famous folk singer in his own right with the group the Sundowners. In 1962, Phil Ochs dropped out of college and followed his college roommate Jim Glover to New York City, where he decided he was going to become a professional musician, and in relatively short order began playing shows around Greenwich Village. Though unpolished at the time, Phil did quickly develop a reputation among his fellow performers as being quite a gifted protest singer. That was a title that Phil himself, at least at the time, never really sat right with him. He always preferred to refer to himself as a topical singer, not necessarily a protest singer. In 1963, Phil Ochs made his debut at the illustrious Newport Folk Festival, where he played along such names as Peter, Paul and Mary, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and of course Pete Seeger. He would return again in 1964. Later in 1963, Phil Ochs would make his first ever appearance at Carnegie Hall as part of sort of a folk hootenanny. He would return in 1966, where he would play his first solo sold-out show at Carnegie Hall. In 1964, Phil Ochs released his first album, All the News That Is Fit to Sing. In 1964, he released his second album, I Ain't Marchin' Anymore. And in 1966, he released his first live album, Phil Ochs in Concert. In 1967, Phil Ochs left both Elektra Records and New York City as he moved to Los Angeles. Later that year, he released his third studio album, Pleasures of the Harbor. And in 1968, he released his second album from California, the appropriately titled Tape from California. Now, in 1969, following the carnage of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Ochs released his fifth studio record, Rehearsals for Retirement. And in 1970, he released what would become his final studio album, which was called Greatest Hits, ironically made up of all new original material. By late 1970, Feeling professionally and creative frustrated, Phil Ochs fell into a deep depression and began relying heavily, or I should say more heavily, on drugs and alcohol. In 1971, Phil Ochs traveled to Chile to meet Chilean folk singer Victor Jara. Victor Jara was one of Phil Ochs' musical and political idols. Of course, Jara would later be assassinated in Chile in 1973. In 1973, as Phil Ochs was traveling in Tanzania, he was robbed, where the assailant stole more than all of his personal belongings. You could argue that he also stole Phil Ochs' livelihood, as in the attack, Phil Ochs was strangled so severely by the assailant that it permanently damaged his vocal cords. This was a loss that, if you read anything about Phil Ochs or see interviews with anybody who was close to him in any way, this was a loss that he really never got over. He never got over the loss of his voice, and in my opinion, it was one of the contributing factors that led to his ultimate demise. In 1975, by 1975, Ochs' multiple addictions and mental health had reached critical mass. According to his brother had repeatedly tried to convince Phil to check himself into some sort of mental facility. By late in 1975, Phil Ochs had taken on the identity of an alter ego who he referred to as John Train. Now, I've also seen interviews with Phil Ochs himself around the same time where he refers to himself as Luke Train. But John Train, the alter ego John Train, according to Phil Ochs at the time, was responsible for murdering Phil Ochs on June 23rd, 1975, in room 714 of the Chelsea Hotel in New York City. The reason given by John Train as to why he killed Phil Ochs was because Phil Ochs drank too much and had become irrelevant. Now, there's a video on YouTube called The Last Days of Phil Ochs. It's a very dark animated short. It is taken from interviews right from Phil Ochs. I would highly recommend checking it out if you are a fan of Phil Ochs. It is very dark, but during most of the interview in that animated short, he is speaking as John Train, although I believe this is the interview I've seen where he actually refers to himself as Luke Train. But he tells the story of how he killed Phil Ochs, and it's really something to listen to. The animation is beautiful. It's dark, obviously, but it's super well done. So if you are a fan of Phil Ochs and you haven't seen the animated short, The Last Days of Phil Ochs, I would highly recommend checking it out on YouTube. By January of 1976, broke and despondent, Phil Ochs took up residence in his sister Nancy's house on Far Rockaway Beach, New York, where in April of that year, his sister Nancy found him after he had committed suicide by hanging himself in her house. Phil Ochs is somebody, this is something that is probably weird. It's something that I do. I don't know if other people do this, but one thing that I really mourn in my life, because I am such a huge Phil Ochs fan, is that, he and I never crossed paths. And I don't mean that in that I never met him. I never, but he passed away. He died in April of 1976. I was born in June of 1976. And it's just something I feel like I missed out on something, just having not, breathed the same air as Phil Ochs. He is somebody that I have a very strong connection to. I am not only a huge fan of his music, but I feel like he is sort of my political kindred spirit. Of anybody I've ever heard interviewed about politics, he is somebody that I pretty much agree with everything he says. I'm also a huge Elvis fan, and there's something weird about the fact that Elvis died in 1977 and I was born in 1976 that gives me some sort of weird comfort. It's like, well, at least I crossed paths with Elvis in some ways. But I do really mourn the idea that I missed out on ever being on this planet at the same time as Phil Ochs. That being said, I should probably get a little bit of therapy or perhaps make a few real friends. I understand that that's probably what you're thinking. Anyway, let's get into Phil Ochs' first record a little bit. Like I said, this record came out in 1964. This record is called All the News That's Fit to Sing. And the first thing I love about this record, which is pretty much everything, I, of course, love the album art. If you listen to Phil Ochs' music, this is exactly how you picture him writing songs. He's got a newspaper, he's got a butt going, he's got his guitar just in case, inspiration strikes. One thing I, love about all of Phil Ochs' music, but especially the first two records, is, I do love how topical it is. I know it was Bob Dylan, who Phil Ochs was pretty good friends with. It was always Bob Dylan who told Phil Ochs that he should sort of take his songwriting in kind of a different direction. Bob Dylan used to tell, Phil Ochs that nobody's going to care about these songs in 2 years because you write on such, topical themes that they aren't timeless. They're very, locked in time. They're very dated. And of course, Bob Dylan was a totally different sort of songwriter. These criticisms had a tendency, by the way, to really, affect Phil Ochs. Phil Ochs was somebody, like most of the people probably who came up in that Greenwich Village scene in New York in the early 60s. Phil Ochs just absolutely idolized Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan knew this, and according to things I've read, Bob Dylan could be quite abrasive and sometimes downright abusive to Phil. I think because he did know that Phil had such a high opinion of him, and he could really damage Phil with his opinions. You sort of imagine Bob Dylan being like, "Come here, kid," just kind of because he had that sort of power over Phil Ochs because Phil so desperately, wanted his approval. I think like a lot of the artists that came out of that era, Bob Dylan was such a unique talent. Not everybody can just string words together as effortlessly as Bob Dylan. And I think that's one thing that frustrated Phil Ochs too, is because Phil Ochs really sweat over his craft. He really worked at it. And I think sometimes he saw Bob Dylan, who was a natural, and there's nothing wrong with being a natural, but sometimes I think he saw Bob Dylan as, almost like a God-type figure. He wanted his approval so desperately. And Bob Dylan was known for kind of giving Phil Ochs the business, if you will. But that's one thing I love about, Phil Ochs, songwriting. I'm such a big fan of history. I'm not saying that I'm a history buff. I'm definitely not an expert. I'm kind of a dumb guy. But I love history, and listening to Phil Ochs' music, it puts you right there. It puts you in the struggle of this era. I grew up as like Generation X. My world that I grew up around was very powdered assery compared to what was going on during the mid-'60s. And listening to Phil Ochs' music, it puts your feet on the ground. You can hear it in his voice. You can read it in his lyrics. You can hear it in his frustration and desperation. You can, he takes you to, he was there. He had his feet on the ground, during, segregation and Vietnam and Kennedy and King and Kennedy and Malcolm X. And if you listen to these records and you read these lyrics, he takes you back there with him. And in a way, I'm so jealous sometimes when I think of people who got to grow up during the turbulent 60s. The worst thing that happened to my generation growing up is when, Kurt Cobain couldn't cope anymore and took himself out. We were just like, oh my God, Kurt Cobain. This guy was writing about, freedom fighters being murdered in the Kennedy assassination and, labor disputes. I mean, this is one of the things I love about this music. Yeah, it's topical, but if you're a fan of history, especially this turbulent era in American history, I mean, he puts you right there. I absolutely love it. So when people like Bob Dylan and probably younger people nowadays say this music doesn't hold up because of how pointed it is, I personally couldn't disagree with you more. So if you're worried about my opinion. Anyway, let's get into this first record a little bit. The first song is a song called One More Parade. This is an outstanding anti-war, anti-Vietnam song that was one of Phil Ochs' many wheelhouses when it came to writing. This song paints the picture of a bunch of young soldiers basically marching off to die in a foreign land for reasons that they aren't entirely sure of. It also talks about how their feelings of patriotism, or in some cases, the socioeconomic status in which they were born, makes them vulnerable to being exploited or downright disposed of by this country's ruling class. Those who, profiteer off of war. I think it's one of all of Phil Ochs' anti-Vietnam songs are great, but it's a great way to kick off the record. I mentioned this earlier. Of course, Phil Ochs is known as being a tremendous lyricist and a beautiful, great singer, but the guitar work on this record, throughout really his career, especially, on these records, because it's just him and his guitar work on this record is unbelievable. The next song is a song called The Thresher, which tells the story of an American nuclear-powered sub which sank in 1963, killing all 129 crewmen on board. Very somber, very beautiful song. The next song after that is Talking Vietnam Blues. This song is another anti-Vietnam jingle. This song takes a look at the behavior of American troops during the conflict. He talks about the irony of liberating citizens of Vietnam basically by burning down their village. I'm not laughing at that, but he talks about the irony of liberating the Vietnamese people through burning down their villages and putting them in concentration camps. It is a very snotty sort of take on the Vietnam War. It is probably not an opinion that a lot of Vietnam veterans, probably not a song a lot of Vietnam veterans would appreciate very much. The next song after that is a song called Lou Marsh. This is the story of a social worker who was beaten to death in the streets of New York City in 1963. Marsh was killed by angry gang members for his work and his dedication of trying to keep young people out of gangs. This was a news story that back in those days, there's probably so much that flew under the radar, but this was a news story that Phil Ochs always thought never got any attention, so of course he wrote a song about it. I think a lot of diehard Phil Ochs fans will tell you that this is probably one of his best songs. I love the song. This album is, as you are probably gathering right now, this album is relatively dark in nature. But I love the song Lou Marsh. The next song after that is Power and Glory, another one of songs that I think a lot of diehard Phil Ochs fans would say is one of his best. I think the song starts off as sort of a love song to just the natural splendor of this country. But then it talks about the contradiction between that and almost the perfection of the land versus the imperfection of those of us who inhabit it. But I do think the song is actually optimistic. I think he says that, we are capable of, solving all of these social ills, the ills of the early 1960s. I think the song actually has an optimistic, maybe uncharacteristically optimistic tinge for Phil Ochs. It's one of my favorite Phil Ochs songs. I think a lot of people would consider it to be one of his best. After that, the next song after that is a song called The Bells. This song is just a folk music interpretation of an Edgar Allan Poe poem, and I don't say just because it's beautiful, but the lyrics are taken out of a Edgar Allan Poe poem put to music by Phil Ochs. That song ends side 1. Side 2 is a song called Automation Song. This song is like a working class anthem told through the experience of those who built both the railroad and the interstate system in this country. It talks about the way they were treated and their plight through trying to deal with their labor conditions. I know I'm not being very articulate about that. The next song after that is The Ballad of William Worthy. William Worthy was an American journalist and civil rights activist who was convicted of illegally traveling to Cuba in 1961. It says on this record sleeve, this is a song about a man who has become the cause in a fight of Americans' freedom to travel. When Worthy heard that Phil had written this song, he came to New York's Third Side Coffee House just to hear him sing it. It's a really good song. He and Phil would eventually become friends throughout the rest of Phil's life. The next song after that is a song called Knock on the Door. This is a song that is just excruciating. This is a song about the act during World War II, basically Nazis going door to door, collecting people who were not Aryan. It reminds me of one of my favorite books of all time, which is The Diary of Anne Frank. Again, growing up in the 1980s as a Gen Xer, hearing stories like this or reading books like this or listening to records like this, you can't help but become more aware of how easy we had it as children. In fact, I think sometimes, the world that we live in today, talking about 2023, and all of these, causes and all of this sort of, manufactured marginalism, all of this stuff isn't the product of our lives being too difficult. All of this is a product of our lives being too easy. I mean, go back and imagine it being hunted by the German army simply because you don't, meet their physical standards. I can't even imagine, honestly. I mean, both my grandfathers were alive during World War II. I can't even imagine the world that they lived in. Like I said, when Kurt Cobain died, we lost it. The next song after that is a song called Talking Cuban Crisis. This is like your typical classic Cold War song. I love the lyrics where it's very dramatic, end of the world type scenario if the communists continue to spread. I love the lyric where he talks about the Holocaust being sponsored by Pepsodent. He says, "Have whiter teeth and cleaner breath as you face your nuclear death." Man, I love it. Another thing that Phil Ochs says, I wouldn't say this is like an underrated aspect of his songwriting, but Phil Ochs' sense of humor, even when writing about really dark issues, always came through. I think that Phil Ochs, much like me, probably always thought he was the funniest guy in the room. The next song after that is Bound for Glory. This is a tribute song to one of Phil's musical heroes, another one of the greatest voices in American music, Woody Guthrie, somebody that Phil Ochs obviously idolized. The next song after that is a song called Too Many Martyrs. This song was written about Medgar Evers, who was an American civil rights activist and the first NAACP field secretary in the state of Mississippi. I mean, you think you've had some bad days at work. I can't even imagine what Medgar Evers went through. He has become the topic of many amazing folk songs. Of course, Medgar Evers was murdered in his home in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963. The next song after that closes out the record. It's a song called What's That I Hear, which is just a very beautiful anti-segregation song. Again, it's funny, I live down here in the southeastern United States at this point in time. I live in what was slave country back in the 1860s and segregation country in the 1960s. And it's interesting, growing up in California, those are both parts of American history that as a Californian are somewhat foreign. But it is interesting to live here in the southeastern United States, where really, just 10 years before I was born, these were the topics of the day. My wife met a relatively elderly man, really elderly man, a couple weeks ago, and he still referred to African Americans as Negroes. It's pretty rough, old timer. Anyway, Phil Ochs would release his second album, I Ain't Marching Anymore, in 1965. This is another one of my favorite records from this era. These first two Phil Ochs records, to me, are pretty much flawless all the way through. I love the cover of this record. I mean, just superficially for a second, please. I mean, how cool is that dude right there? I mean, you take Elvis Presley, John Wayne, and Woody Guthrie, and he's sitting on the streets of New York. You can tell it's just like a gritty, rough road in New York City. He's got the pea coat going. He's got the pompadour. I mean, just superficially, beyond all the amazing things that he stood for and wrote about and sang about, come on. Look at me. Why do I have to be me? Anyway, one thing I love about this record is over here in this margin, the gray margin. I know you can't really see what's written over there, but because it's small. But where the songs are, Phil himself has written sort of very brief liner notes about each song. I always tell people this when they give me guff about collecting records. Like, why do you still collect records? I mean, this is why you still collect records. If you are really passionate about music and you want to know as much as you possibly can about songs you love and artists you love, this is why you still buy records. I mean, look at all this text. Look at album art. This is stuff that, and again, I'm not judging if you're a streamer. I stream all the time. I listen to Spotify way more than I actually sit down and put on records. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, this is why you still collect records, honestly. The first song on this record is the title track, I Ain't Marching Anymore. One of the best anti-war songs I've ever heard. I think it's one of the best in his entire catalog. It's told as sort of a history lesson, taking you through different military conflicts in United States history, and how disposable young people, especially members of the lower class and the brown and black communities, how disposable they are when it comes to the ruling class chasing the buck. It really points out people who profiteer off of the death of young people. It is incredibly powerful. The next song after that is In the Heat of the Summer. This is a song about the race riots in New York in 1964. In his little liner notes, Phil Ochs himself writes, scenes and images of the riots last summer in Harlem. As is usually the case, the loudest bursts of outrage come from those most responsible for creating the debacle. I mean, how many of us wish we could write words like that? Anyway, the next song after that is one of my favorite songs on the record. This is my favorite Phil Ochs record, if you go through and dig through the catalog. If you're only going to get one, which you shouldn't, this has to be it, in my opinion. But the next song is one of my favorite songs on this record, which is the Draft Dodger Rag. This song is actually really funny. It's imagining a kid going into the draft board after being drafted and basically going over a litany of reasons as to why he can't serve his country, all of which are, ridiculous, and they get increasingly more ludicrous as the song goes on. Phil Ochs himself wrote in the liner notes, in Vietnam, a 19-year-old Viet Cong soldier screams that Americans should leave his country as he's shot by a government firing squad. His American counterpart, meanwhile, is staying up nights thinking of ways to deceptively destroy his health, mind, virility to escape 2 years in a relatively comfortable army. Free enterprise strikes again. The profiteering of war was a topic that Phil Ochs was very passionate about, came through in all of his songwriting. Draft Dodger Rag is one of my favorite songs on the record. Like I said, it's got, he puts humor in, very serious topics. That's a gift, I think, that he had in his songwriting. The next song after that is called That's What I Want to Hear, a song about, basically about the unemployment crisis in America during the time. He himself writes, there are many fine, sentimental, out-of-work songs floating around, but as unemployment figures grow larger, so grows the need for more realistic songs and, consequently, actions. Again, one of the things I love about this record is he basically tells you himself what he was thinking when he writes these songs. The next song after that is That Was the President. This is a song that was... this is a very haunting, sad, sort of beautiful song about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was somebody that Phil Ochs supported completely. There was a lot of people who, if you go back and you look at Phil Ochs, his childhood, he grew up with a father who was basically probably post-traumatic stress, World War II vet, very, emotionally unavailable. He kind of worked a lot to I think, distract himself from what was going on in his head. He was never really there for Phil Ochs as a kid. And a lot of people have said, if you go back and you read books or you look at documentaries on the topic of Phil Ochs, a lot of people say that Phil Ochs almost saw Kennedy as a father figure, and he took Kennedy's assassination incredibly hard. In the liner notes, Phil Ochs writes himself, my Marxist friends can't understand why I wrote this song, and that's probably one of the reasons why I'm not a Marxist. After the assassination of Fidel Castro, aptly pointed out that only fools could rejoice at such a tragedy. One of the things about this song also is it talks about the tragedy of the Kennedy assassination, what it meant politically and publicly. But one of my favorite things about this song is that it really paints Kennedy as being like a man. He was a human. He was a son, a husband, a father, apart from being just a public figure. That's one of the things I love about the song is it really humanizes Kennedy. Again, I don't disagree with people who say that Phil Ochs felt a very strong personal connection to John F. Kennedy. The next song after that is Iron Lady. This is a song about the 1960 execution of serial rapist Carolyn Chessman in the San Quentin gas chamber. Basically a song pointing out the absurdity of capital punishment. The next song after that, actually from the liner notes, Phil Ochs himself writes, a century from now, intelligent men will read in amazement about the murder of Carolyn Chessman and wonder what excuse for society flourished in these times. The idea of the song was given to me by a social worker in Ohio who had taken the phrase from a poem written by a man on death row. Obviously, I don't really know much about who Carolyn Chessman was. I had to look it up. He was a He was convicted, at least, of being a serial rapist. Probably not somebody you'd want to live next door to you. The next song after that ends side one. It is called The Highwayman. This is another one of the poems which Phil Ochs set to music. This was a poem by Alfred Noyes. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I'm terrible with names. The first song on side two is a song called Links on the Chain. This is a song about the labor issues in the United States during this era. It talks about the corruptibility of the labor unions. The song, in the liner notes himself, Phil Ochs writes, historically, labor unions have been a catalyst of social change, and in my opinion have a definite responsibility to be in the vanguard of important battles. When the civil rights struggle came to a head, they had become such a part of the establishment that the old lions of the left were the new pillars of the segregated substructure. But I am sure they'll be able to straighten out this embarrassment at one of their many White House meetings. So apparently he's accusing the labor unions of being pro-segregation also, which I hadn't, listening to the song and studying the lyrics, I hadn't really thought that much about. The next song after that is called Hills of West Virginia. To me, this is basically a very straightforward, non-political song. This is basically just a love song about the natural splendor of West Virginia. On the liner notes himself, he writes, on one of my trips to Hazard, Kentucky, I drove through West Virginia with Eric Anderson and found myself renewing an old habit of pretending that I was taking pictures in my mind with a camera. When the trip was over, I set down these images, which really don't have any special message. I think it's just a song about the natural landscape of West Virginia. It's a really cool song. I love the lyrics. It is very poetic. It's not... Phil Ochs would, later on in his career, he would do more stuff that wasn't so overtly political. The next song after that is The Man Behind the Guns. The Men Behind the Guns. This is another poem. This one was a poem written by John Rooney that Phil Ochs set to music. The next song is Talking at Birmingham Jam. This song is about the freedom fighters who rode into the South from the Northeast. The song in the liner notes, Phil Ochs himself talks about, in Birmingham, tourist city of the South, you can bomb the church of your own choice with the apparent blessing of Governor George Wallace. Birmingham is one of the cities that has made the FBI what it is today. I've been to Birmingham. It's quite a lovely city, I must say. I don't know that I would necessarily want to live in Birmingham during 1965. But like I said earlier, it's interesting living in this part of the country, knowing that you can drive, 2.5 hours from my house here in Nashville and be in Birmingham, where all of this craziness took place. I mean, a lot of craziness happened here in Tennessee as well. The next song after that is Ballad of the Carpenter. This is basically a cover song by another one of Phil Ochs' musical heroes, British folk singer Evan McCall. Evan McCall's version of this song is beautiful. Also, I sort of prefer the Phil Ochs version of it. The next song is, the last two songs on this record are right up there with my favorites. This one is called Days of Decision. This song is about the 1964 murder of civil rights activists James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Shermer in Philadelphia, Mississippi. This was the story that inspired the film Mississippi Burning, one of my favorite movies of all time. In the liner notes, Phil Ochs himself writes, An American politician has developed into a gutless master of procrastination with a maximum of non-committal statements and the barest minimum of action. As a Morrissey fan, I have to mention the fact also that Morrissey did a very lovely cover of this song on his 2019 cover album, California Sun, which is probably my favorite song off of that Morrissey record. Not unrelated to the fact that Phil Ochs is probably my favorite folk artist of all time. The next song after that ends the album, which is Here's to the State of Mississippi. A great song. If you're a resident of Mississippi back in 1965, you probably weren't too tickled about it. But it's basically a song which is giving permission to the state of Mississippi to secede from the Union, explaining to them in no uncertain terms that they would not be missed if they decided to take that course of action. Like I said, this record came out in 1965. It is probably my favorite record in the Phil Ochs catalog. Following that, in 1966, and I'm not going to go through all these records in as much depth because we're already getting a little long-winded here. I realize you've probably hung yourself 10 minutes ago, and I'm just still sitting here yakking. But Phil Ochs released his first live album in 1966. This is a great live record if you haven't ever checked it out. This has probably my favorite all-time Phil Ochs song on it, which is a live version of the song When I'm Gone. It also has Canons of Christianity, which is just unbelievable. There But for Fortune, Cops of the World, Santo Domingo, and the song Love Me, I'm a Liberal, which is one of my favorite songs in the Phil Ochs catalog as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that he also put out Pleasures of the Harbor. This record came out in 1967. This is sort of where he almost kind of, I would say, started to change course a little bit. Of course, this is after he had moved to California. His songwriting sort of changed up a little bit. This has a couple of his most celebrated songs on it, The Crucifixion and the title track, Pleasures of the Harbor. His songwriting style kind of began to change here. There's not as much political stuff on this record. Some of the songs are really long. He's got one 6-minute long song on this record. He's got 3 songs on this record that are over 8 minutes long. There's only 8 songs on the whole record. According to things I've read and heard, right before this, leaving New York, moving to Los Angeles, sort of stylistically changing a little bit, he had just really become, really sort of burnt out on New York. He needed to change the scenery. I love the back cover of this record. That is quite a nice little picture of him and his daughter. So I would also check out Pleasures of the Harbor. Now, I don't think it's quite as good as the first 2 records. After that, in 1968, he put out a record called Tape from California, which apparently I don't have on vinyl. I'm not very happy about that. I've been going around boasting for years that I own the guy's entire catalog. But as I was digging through my mess over there, I was unable to find it. So that means I'm going to have to go out and make that one of my next purchases. I love that record. As far as that record goes, I think that record is probably better than Pleasures of the Harbor, Tape from California. To me, the 3 standout songs for me on that record are The War Is Over, which is one of the best protest songs he ever did. It was decided among him and some of his friends who they sort of co-created at the time what they called the Yippie Party. Was the best way to win the war was just to end the war, declare the war was over. Not necessarily win the war, but to end the war was just to announce it was over. You weren't going to end the war in Washington, so in both New York and Los Angeles at the time, they had protests declaring the war was over. People were running through the streets of Manhattan, running up, hugging strangers, kissing, running through traffic, declaring the war was over. That's one of my favorite songs off that record. One of my favorite songs in the entire Phil Ochs catalog. I also love the song Joe Hill and Half Century High. I love that record as well. In 1969, following the riots at the Chicago Democratic National Convention and the trial of the Chicago Seven, a trial which Phil Ochs testified in, he released this record, Rehearsals for Retirement. He released this record, he wrote this record as sort of a eulogy for the liberal American, kind of acknowledging defeat almost against, the ruling class, the Nixon America. This is a very dark record. I mean, obviously the the album cover doesn't really, it does paint sort of a picture. If you notice, the postscript date is the day of the riots in Chicago. Well, it's not the day, but it says Chicago, Illinois, 1968, inspired by the riots outside of the Democratic National Convention. At a certain point, Phil Ochs, I think, began to feel, like probably even before 1968, I think Phil Ochs began to feel as though the anti-war movement and the anti-segregation crowd, I think he started to feel like that scene had become infiltrated too much by drug use. And I don't think that Phil Ochs, and I guess maybe I shouldn't speculate on this, but I would guess, having read books and seen documentaries on Phil Ochs, I don't know that Phil Ochs necessarily aligned himself what was coming out of San Francisco in terms of like the hippie movement. I think he wanted the left-wing, anti-war, anti-segregation, pro-labor movement in this country to be taken more seriously, and I think that he saw the Summer of Lovers and the Grateful Dead and the Crosby, Stills, and Nash hippie people as being people that were easily dismissed by mainstream America. I think he wanted to have a little bit more credibility. And this record, obviously this record came out during 1969, post-Summer of Love, Woodstock era. I think he was sort of a metaphor for the fact that his time had kind of come and gone. In 1970, Phil Ochs released his final studio record, Phil Ochs' Greatest Hits. I mentioned earlier, ironically titled because the record is made up of all original new material. At the time, Phil Ochs is dressed up on the cover in the sort of knockoff Elvis Presley gold lame suit. When he toured on this record, he wore the gold lame suit. He toured and played in front of basically a rock-style band. You can go back and listen to live recordings of Phil Ochs around this era. And his fans just did not, buy into this era of his career. You can go back and listen to live bootlegs on YouTube or other, outlets where you can hear his crowd in between songs around this era, screaming at him, "Where's Phil Ochs? You killed Phil Ochs. What is this?" To me, this record isn't very good. I mean, it's got a couple of okay songs on it. Some people say that he was just really desperate. He was really trying to gain some sort of commercial viability. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I almost just feel like this was him sort of the beginning of his sort of mental health crises. This was also, around the time when his alcoholism had really begun to, take foot. So this record, I'm not going to say you shouldn't listen to it. I'm not going to say you shouldn't own it. One thing I love about this record, and it's a silly thing, but, Elvis Presley, of course, released the record. 50 million Elvis fans can't be wrong in his true, self-deprecating, great sense of humor, in my opinion. Phil Ochs, of course, if you look at the top of this record, it says 50 Phil Ochs fans. I can't be wrong. So I wouldn't necessarily run out and, break down break into a record store at night to get this one illegally, but I don't think it's the worst thing I've ever heard. Definitely not as good as the first two records. Those first two records I went into more in depth are easily my first two favorite. Those to me are records that I will be listening to forever. Probably most of his catalog, with the exception of maybe this one. I never listen to this one. To me, it's a collection piece, if nothing else. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. Go back and dig through the catalog of Phil Ochs. I do not believe you will be disappointed. Now, I realize this is sort of a stylistic change for me on this channel compared to a lot of the music I listen to, but I'm telling you right now, Phil Ochs in the mid-'60s was every bit as punk rock as Joe Strummer was in the mid-'70s. Anyway, check back every week for Morrissey Monday, my weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, I'll talk to you then.